All right, good afternoon and welcome back to Track 4, Science and Technology Innovation, and thank you to Pfizer for sponsoring the afternoon's lunch. I'm Tammy Johnston from Ambry Genetics, and I will be your last room host for the day. As a reminder, we would like to welcome those of you joining remotely through the live stream, and remember to download our mobile app to use some of the highlighted features like live Q&A. For the first session this afternoon, we're joined by Deckel Geldman, CEO of FDNA, and Dave Jacob, CEO of Think Genetic, who will be talking about artificial intelligence, making research and diagnosis faster and more accurate. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, everyone. So before we dive into this fascinating and complex world of artificial intelligence, or AI, I want to share a story with you. The outlines of this story are probably familiar to a lot of people in this audience, but nevertheless, this is a story about Morgan. And Morgan is 5 years old. She lives in New York. I think the most notable thing about Morgan is, as you can see, her smiles lights up the room. Morgan is also a very expressive little girl. She likes to play outside. She is intensely curious about her environment. She loves to go to the beach. When Morgan was born, her parents, Trish and John, were overwhelmed with joy. She was a quiet, happy little baby. She seemed perfectly healthy. But as time passed by, the greatest fear of every parent came to life. And Morgan didn't develop as she was expected to. Morgan didn't grow. She didn't walk, run, or jump. She didn't talk when kids her age were supposed to. She even needed help getting out of bed, getting dressed, eating. Months turned into years. And her parents were seeking a medical answer, a medical solution for Morgan's problem. They saw an area of physicians. They saw occupational therapists, a lot of pediatricians, neurologists, endocrinologists, special educators. No one had answers. Trish and John felt isolated, alone. Test after test revealed nothing. 3 years later, they find an answer. Whole exome sequencing found a very rare variation in the HNRNPH2 gene. But that answer didn't mean anything to them. There were no treatments available, no support groups. John and Trish didn't even know what this means for Morgan's future. Morgan was one of a handful of people in the world found with this specific rare variation. This is Lily. If Lily looks familiar to you, it's for good reason. You see, Lily and Morgan share a lot in common. They both love to sing, they both love to play outside, and they both carry that very rare genetic mutation. But they also have a lot of physical traits in common. They have the same set of eyes, the same nose structure, the same full cheeks. What we've learned is that for thousands of rare diseases, the same genetic variant that caused the disease often causes the patient to have very similar and distinct facial features. Now, back in 2011, there was a group of talented people developing or just completing the development of a technology that was able to recognize faces with an accuracy of above 97%, almost as good as human beings by recognizing people from photos. This technology ended up being sold to Facebook, and you all know it today if you use Facebook and you tag images. But for part of that group, that wasn't enough. They thought there has to be something more meaningful to this type of technology than simply tagging friends' photos over the internet. And so we embarked on a mission. We were focused on taking this technology and translating it into healthcare. We thought that that's the way that we can have the largest impact on people's lives. So we started interviewing a lot of different experts. And I can remember meeting the clinical geneticists that we first met as if it were yesterday. We met with Dr. Anik Raz-Rothschild in Jerusalem, in Israel. And she started to show us photos of patients with rare diseases. And she talked about those similarities and how that's so important in making a diagnosis. She also talked about the unmet need and the diagnostic odyssey that rare disease patients, specifically kids and their families, go through. That's pretty much the genesis of FDNA. That's when we decided that we have to get involved. There was simply no turning back for us. And what hit us the most is that doctors see these patients all day long. They just don't know how to pick up the signs. So one thing about innovation or disruption is that it usually comes from outsiders. You can't expect someone who's been dealing with these sort of issues day after day to come up with an innovative and fresh perspective. We've tried to look at this from the perspective of a doctor. The doctor sees hundreds of kids every week. How can we expect a doctor to suspect a rare disease? How can we expect a doctor to know which one of the thousands of diseases can affect the child? How could they? They've never even seen a case of a specific syndrome throughout their entire career. Sometimes they've never even heard of that. Even the most accurate and advanced genetic testing sometimes misses the answer. This is where we come in. So we've developed this technology that uses artificial intelligence and state-of-the-art computer vision or facial analysis. We've trained the system not only to look at faces and understand what a face means, but to identify specific patterns or recognizable patterns within these faces. Now, you see, what's different about what we've done is we haven't taught the system to look at a person or a bunch of photos and say, this is Bill or this is Jessica. We're taking photos of patients that share common rare diseases or the common variant, and we teach the system to recognize very subtle patterns that are common between these patients. Now, it's not only about the facial analysis. Artificial intelligence, as you've probably heard, is much more than that. It's the art of taking big data, translating that into conclusions in a cognitive way. We take more than just the facial photos. We take clinical signs annotated by physicians. We take the genetic testing and the results. We pull all that big data, and from thousands of possible syndromes and tens of thousands of clinical signs and hundreds of thousands of possible genetic variants, we showed a doctor a short list of syndromes that should be considered in the evaluation in reaching a diagnosis. At a certain point of time, and back in 2014, cloud computing was starting, and the iPhone was launched. And so we decided that it would be very helpful if we can pack this all up and launch an iPhone app. We called it Face to Gene. I admit it's not very creative, but pretty suggestive. And we made it free of charge for clinicians to use, so they can use it anytime, anywhere. Within a few short years from the launch, we now have the majority of clinical geneticists in the world using Face to Gene. Clinicians from over 2,000 clinical sites from over 130 countries are using Face to Gene daily. Now, every time a clinician uses Face to Gene, the photo is uploaded into our cloud, into the internet. And that helps train our system to identify additional patterns to get more accurate. It's what we call a learning system. Now, Lily and Morgan helped our system identify that pattern for that specific genetic rare variant. And every time we identify a new pattern, it goes back into FaceToGene, and it helps the doctor recognize the next syndrome. We take all that information, we link between the facial photos, the clinical signs, what we call phenotypes, the genetic variants. We put all that together into one big secure database containing currently over 10,000 disorders. About a quarter of them, 2,500, have these recognizable patterns in their face. Now, anytime that a doctor from New York or Tel Aviv or Berlin encounters a patient with unexplained facial features, they can access this database free of charge through FaceToGene and potentially help that patient reach a diagnosis, ending that journey, and hopefully saving the family years of searching for the answer. Here's a quick look at how it looks. This is FaceToGene. We've uploaded a photo of Morgan, and on the right-hand side, you see the actual photo of Morgan. On the left-hand side, our model. The model is comprised by all the different children carrying the same mutation, able to train our system. It's not a real photo of an individual. And the system is able to show where it found similarities between the photo and the average appearance, the characteristic appearance of that child. It actually also evaluates how similar they are for an area of syndromes. So it's not just this specific syndrome. A physician doesn't need to know what they're looking for. One of the major challenges that we've faced is patient privacy. We're dealing with patient photos. By definition, this is personal health identifier. And so how do you overcome that challenge? We did that with technology as well. So we've encrypted every photo as it goes on the cloud, and it gets de-identified. Only the physician uploading the photo can see that photo. We never see that photo. But with deep learning, which is part of AI, we're able to de-identify and use these very distinct patterns to teach the system. At some point, we were bombarded with a lot of requests to start doing research. And so we've decided that we would make this technology available free of charge to researchers, and researchers including researchers working with patient advocacy groups and support groups. This has been very successful. It helps us target specific populations and not just get what we get from the clinic all day long. When we do that, we're able to create those subtle patterns for syndromes that may not have been described properly in the past, or may have just been discovered through whole exome sequencing or genome sequencing. All these patterns are then rolled back into FaceToGene, applied back again into clinic, and helping doctors in their daily effort to diagnose these patients. This initial success of research has opened up a lot of doors, not only for Lily and Morgan, but for other patients with unknown syndromes. We are literally holding up hundreds of research projects as we speak right now. A lot of them are extremely successful, result in papers published in scientific publications. So you see a number of them. Interestingly, we've just completed a project with the KBG Foundation, and they were able to add to their registry about 200 patients through our collaboration. They only had 60 when we started. So I want to ask the crowd here, how many people, by raise of hand, have smartphones with them? Pretty safe to say everyone. And how many people out of those who have smartphones have a photo gallery filled up with photos of their children? What if that photo could help diagnose your child? What if that photo could help another family diagnose their children? What if that photo can help bring together a community of people across the world that share the same genetic mutation, can work together in research to develop better diagnostics and better therapeutics? The future for us is very exciting. We are going beyond the realm of just facial analysis. Our artificial intelligence engine is so powerful that we are starting to integrate other biometric data, whether it's video processing, voice processing, medical imaging. Our goal is to focus on how to promote phenotyping, the observation of the clinical signs with the human genome. How can we help diagnose more patients? How can we help bring therapeutics to the market? We're already working with and integrated with hospitals, labs, drug developers. For Morgan and Lily, this has been a very fruitful collaboration. We've already identified 20 other little girls around the world that shared the same mutation. We're now working together to not only develop technology, but increase awareness, bring this technology to doctors so that they can identify other patients with the HNRNPH2 mutation. We call this the Yellow Brick Road Project, and we partner with them because we're laying one brick at a time. Our goal is to complete that journey, to end the diagnostic odyssey for the patients and their families. We call you, all this community, to join us, to work together and try to find the same technology that can help with other diseases. Thank you.
Thanks, Deckel. That is not good. Truly, and it's fascinating technology. Artificial intelligence in general is fascinating. How many people in here are patients or caregivers? Just medical professionals? Others? Techies like me? I want to share a story with you, much as Deckel did, to get an idea of where did Think Genetic come from and what is this artificial intelligence and how did I come up with this idea about 4 years ago. And my story started, I have a rare condition, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but I was born with a rare congenital heart problem. They needed to do surgery, but there was not a surgery that had been tested yet on infants, so they waited until I was 5 before they would repair my heart, is where the problem was. And they did that by cutting out my rib, and that's how they got to my heart, and fixing it. And I always knew that was going to be an interesting time and wondering how I would grow up, etc. Right after my surgery, my sister was born with same condition, same surgery. Since then, they basically said, you're fine. It was caused probably by your parents smoked or phase of the moon. So they didn't know. There was no diagnosis. And I went on to lead what I thought was a normal life. I actually got drafted after college. I was a Navy pilot. I was a professional bowler. I started a technology company. Didn't know any different. Raised a family, 3 kids. When I turned 60, I was still a pilot. I was out of the Navy, but I flew my plane from Boston, where I live, to Atlanta. I wanted to witness the birth of my second grandson. And while I was there, I got sick. And it was just very strange. I thought I had the flu. That's what I thought. So I was there for the birth, jumped back in my plane. Shouldn't have done that, but I did. Flew back to Boston, and I was worse. So I immediately went to my doctor from the airport, put my plane away, went to the airport. To the doctor and said, something's wrong. I've never felt like this before. And the doctor said, well, you have full-blown pneumonia. Go to bed. So I did that. And 2 weeks later, it was much better, but I was still weak. And they decided to do a CAT scan on my lungs just to see what was going on with the pneumonia. They said, well, your lungs are fine, but you have this 4-centimeter aneurysm you probably ought to do something about on your aorta ascending. I said, where did that come from? And they said, well, we don't know, but we'll repair it when it gets to 5. So I called my sister And I said, I don't know what's going on. You need to go have an echocardiogram. It's just, I don't know why I thought that, but I said, go do it. She had the same aneurysm. So Think Genetic is going to help us solve some of these problems, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the question is, I still didn't know it was genetic. I just knew this is very strange. And I started looking on the internet, fairly early in the internet, trying to find answers to what my condition was. No good information. I mean, it was just all over the map. Something heart-related, something lung-related, I don't know. I feel fine now, etc. But I thought we really need to get an answer for this, and for my sister and I are worried about my kids and then my grandkids. You know, what might they have inherited from me that I don't know anything about? So I did the only thing that I knew to do was I made my own genetic counselor. And the reason it took me so long to get diagnosed is she had to grow up and go to college and become a genetic counselor, go to Emory, and there she is. And she is also one of the founders of Think Genetic. That I had been an IBM Premier Business Partner since 1993. That was my technical background. And when IBM Watson won Jeopardy, IBM came to the Premier Business community and said, we think Watson can do more than Jeopardy. We think it belongs in healthcare. Does anybody have any ideas for how we might use it? And I went, sure, I want to find genetic diseases like me and make it easier for other people. And so I bid to IBM and got a commercial agreement from them, which was a big deal at the time, which gave me 2 years of free access to Watson to try and build this application. So we started doing it. The problem that I had is technically I had the team and the staff to build the application, but how do I train a computer system in genetic conditions? I had no idea. So back to Dawn. I said, Dawn, you think Emory'd be interested in training Watson? And she said, of course, because she's like her dad. And so the important part of that is the thing that makes artificial intelligence work is the knowledge that you put into the system so that it can make predictive analysis. And you've been reading a lot about IBM Watson lately having problems and it's not working. And the problem is they're consuming data from everywhere. And for those of us who have been in technology a long time, whatever you put in determines what comes out. So I used the example of one of the first things we looked at. She's an expert in lysosomal storage diseases, so Fabry. And so I'm learning all of this terminology, right? It's part of my education now. One of them was Marfan's. And so what we would do is we would train the system, then we would tweak it, and then we would see how it worked and what the answer was that came out of the system. And so we were working on Marfan's, which is in the family of connective tissues disorders that I have. In fact, I was evaluated for Marfan's and other related things. And one of the conditions of Marfan's, if you don't know, is it generally affects tall, skinny people like basketball players. And one of the symptoms is a depressed chest. So into Watson we go and we say, we put in the symptom depressed chest, and out comes out is you need to see your psychiatrist, you have emotional problems. So a little more training to do. So that shows some of the complexity of what we have to do. We have to get the content right. We can write the math algorithms, we can do the special sauce that makes it come out right, but without that knowledge we can't do it. So Dawn has been instrumental in the growing up of Watson, and she actually has gone to 100 of her closest genetic counselor friends around the world, and we hire them to do certain diseases that they're knowledgeable in. So at this point, we have covered about 250 diseases, all of the things in the newborn screening, things for which there are treatment, things for which there are clinical trials, and our goal, sort of like Declan, is we've got the yellow brick road. We want all 7,000. We want to be the place you go to find this information. The other thing that Declan and I share in common is we believe the diagnosis starts with the patient, that it's always been backwards in rare genetic things. You can't rely on anyone in the medical profession to be an expert in these 7,000 really different kind of things. It's too much for anybody to know. But I can promise you that the patient, and generally the mother of the patient, is out there looking for answers. They know something's wrong, and they've been to a lot of people and haven't gotten an answer. So let me show you how we do this with Think Genetic. I'll show you a little bit of background of what I learned. So when I built the, are these both live, or does it matter what I do? We okay? I don't want to do both, that's all. You're good. I'm good, okay, thanks. So we're up. So the question I had when I started building the platform is there a business case for this? Being a businessman, I want to know, is there a market for what I'm doing? Is there anybody out? The question is, anybody as crazy as me that won't give up trying to find the answer? And I found out that there are a lot of people like that. And it turns out to be a couple 100 million people like that. So let me walk through how we got to the business case and then what we're doing to build that. So it's always going to be free to patients, always free to doctors, and we make our money by finding undiagnosed patients, getting them into the system, and pharmas want that information, clinical trial people want that information, CROs want that information. If we can speed up the pipeline, that has great value to the whole system, and that's where we'll make our money, and have been making our money. So many of you know this, if you've been down this road, that the healthcare system is not set up to do a lot of analysis, so generally a doctor's appointment, mine is the same way. When I go in once a year for my echocardiogram and have my aneurysm measured, I get about 10 minutes with the doctor, and the decision is it time for surgery or not? You're good, go home. I'll see you next year. So that's the way it works. But there's just not enough time. You're on a tight schedule, and you can't do a lot of analysis. You have to deal with what you see. And as we get into rare diseases, the knowledge base is just hard. It's just too much. You can't be trained. Some people say, well, older doctors can't know because they didn't get it in school, but I don't know that anybody gets it as part of their specialty unless they specialize in genetics. So it's just a hard problem. So we need to help them find the information and give them information so they know where to look. So this is the marketplace we see. It's a very big marketplace. And in fact, I'll talk about where we are right now. Think Genetic is in beta since last June with these 300 diseases, and we purposely are not advertising it. We just put it out on the internet to see if our analytics capability was good enough that potential undiagnosed patients could find us. In that 12 months, we have been spread basically organically by people talking to each other in 170 countries. They're finding us. So we know that it works. Now can we give them good information? That's going to be the next thing. So here's a good example. Not picking on the Genzyme world of Fabry, but I'm just saying this is a disease that's been around for a number of years with a treatment, several support groups, and they're dealing with 25% basically of the population that they can't find the others. They know they're out there, statistically they exist, but how do you find them? So it's sales reps calling on ophthalmologists, calling on patients, doing family histories, all of those kind of things, trying to find it, and still we've got 75% to go probably. So think about the ones that don't have the maturity of this yet, and how do you find those? So history, so I'm kind of an outlier. See, average of 7 physicians, I've done that. Actually, I've been to 5 different hospitals, Johns Hopkins, Emory, University of Pittsburgh, where my clinical study is, Mass General. And the mean time of symptom diagnosis, 4.8 years, so I screwed that all up. I was 60. Okay. But I didn't have artificial intelligence. I only had to grow my own genetic counselor. Okay. So our approach is totally patient-focused. We want the patient to come to us. So we want to educate the patient. And what generally happens is they are Googling in the middle of the night. It's interesting that we get questions to our genetic counselors. We get about 5 a day on average from around the world. Every weekend, it about doubles. So they have 48 hours to Google. So that's what happens. So the idea is, well, how do we meet the patient at the internet and entice them, and that's the right word, to get them into the system? So they're looking at their symptoms, and Think Genetic will pop up on the first page, and I'll show you a lot of examples of that here in a minute. The question is, when they see Think Genetic, they don't know it's genetic, they just know something's wrong. So eventually they get so frustrated, they click the button for Think Genetic to say, well, I don't know, I haven't tried this, let's see where we go. And they start getting reliable, referenced information, and it's totally based on answering the question. If you ask a question of Think Genetic, you get an answer. You don't have to read a reference book, you don't have to read a manual, we answer the question. The second thing that happens with our cognitive computing is it answers the question and then poses 5 or 6 other questions. So what it can figure out is, well, let's say in the case of Fabry disease, you said, what are the symptoms of Fabry disease? We answer that question, and then we have questions all around it. Well, are you looking for treatment? Do you have a kid that has this? Do you have other questions? And we pose all of those, and so you start getting educated. And the way that Think Genetic provides all the way through the knowledge is it's a GPS for genetics. Start with discovery. If they come in at that level, then we pull them down to, let's talk about symptoms. Have questions for that. Then we say, let's talk about inheritance. Do you have it in your family somewhere else? Have you ever thought about it, that you might have it somewhere else? So in my case, my sister had it. Oh, that means it could be genetic. And then eventually we'll walk down into their clinical trials for this, or you need to see a genetic counselor, or here's some symptom information you need to take to your doctor and talk about your condition. And we'll give them the knowledge that they can then research that condition without having to spend a lot of time figuring out what it is. So clearly our main goal is to decrease the time to diagnosis. That's what we all want. We want to get people that have a condition into treatment, however we do that. Think Genetic does not want to own the patient. We just want to have them get to treatment, however we can do that, just like me. Okay, so now let's branch out of this and I'll actually show you the product in action, a couple of different ways. So the first product, when we put up the 250 conditions, so nobody's going to go directly to Think Genetic. There's no way you would even know to look there. You know now because I told you. But let's say that you're Googling and asking questions. So let me start with Fabry disease. That's a fairly common one. So if I know about the disease, what do I tell my teacher, my students, my coach, my parents, my grandparents, anything close to that question we'll pick up because we call it fuzzy logic, but we understand the question you're asking, whether it's a particular person or not, but it's about Fabry, and I want to know what to tell my teacher. And so this is just an organic search. We've not staged this in any way. So this is Google doing its magic, and you notice that we come up on this list, number 2. And if we click on that answer, what you'll do is now you're going into Think Genetic, and we answer that question. And if I scroll down a little bit, you see after we answer the question, first there's I can't see. In the middle there, under Show More, it's referenceable, so we have a reference for the patient to know where the information came from, and we also have a reference for a physician so that they can do the detailed medical work if they want to understand exactly what's going on. And then we pose the related questions in the same area. So in this case, you're kind of in the overview of the disease, so we pose other questions. And this is basically Watson thinking of, well, this is what you're interested in. Let me see if I have other information in this area. So here are a bunch more questions about Fabry disease and how that works. And then eventually, let me show you how it's laid out too. So these are the sections. So depending where you come into Think Genetic, you basically go down. So if you come in at the top, you work your way all the way down, eventually to, in fact, living with is the bottom level, which is where most of our questions and answers are, because we right now have mostly known diseases. Okay, and I can do that for lots of different diseases and questions. There are a couple 100,000 questions now in our content database, so if you ask about a rare genetic disease and it's one of the 250 or 300 that we've curated, then we're going to be on the first page, probably at the top. Okay, so that's the idea. Will it work? It does work. And this is how we prove that it works. Now, what we're doing now is, so that's great if you know kind of what the disease is or you have some idea, but what if you have no idea and you just have some symptoms and they're kind of all over the map and you don't know what to do? The thing that we are building right now that will be released in December is called our symptom matcher, and it's being patented right now. And it basically starts from symptoms in Google, same place. And when you start putting in symptoms, Think Genetic is watching what's coming into the internet, and if it thinks it's genetic, it's going to grab you. And let me show you how that works. And I'll do that with a video. I think that's even better because it's not released yet, but the terminology that we're going to put in to the symptom matcher is still in Google. It's just we haven't released the product, so it only goes so far and then it stops. But this is an actual case, and we're doing this disease by disease. So we'll have 100 diseases done by the end of the year. So let's take a look at this video. So this is a little 4-minute thing that will explain how symptom matcher works, and is working in the lab.
Why would Think Genetic invest in a symptom matcher, which uses artificial intelligence with common search engines like Google? Good question. Here are the facts. Families living with rare genetic conditions don't know it's genetic initially. On average, they will see 7 doctors over 5 years before diagnosis. In the meantime, they will search literally for answers. 80% of health inquiries start with an online search, so Think Genetic believes we should meet the patients where they are, searching online. In this video, we're using Think Genetic's Symptom Matcher to discover genetic possibilities for chronic symptoms. In this scenario, I'm a parent searching for my 18-month-old son. I'm concerned about a few symptoms that I've noticed, like reoccurring ear infections, hernias, and noisy breathing. Notice that these terms bring up a Think Genetic landing page. This introduces the genetic possibilities for the symptoms I'm searching on and asks related questions as an introduction to Symptom Matcher. As I enter Symptom Matcher, it will first collect some basic general demographic information, such as age and ethnicity, which may apply to certain conditions, and also asks about any genetic history I may know about in my family. Now, Symptom Matcher asks me about my son's symptoms using the body as a guide. I choose to start with the head. In this section, I add that my son's teeth aren't well developed, his mouth appears to be wider than average, and he has full lips. Each symptom is added to my initial inputs and narrows the possibilities of a genetic explanation from over 7,000. Notice symptoms are in common versus medical terminology. Unlike general symptom matchers, Think Genetic Symptom Matcher guides me through the selection process, narrowing genetic conditions and symptoms as I go. After seeing symptoms I hadn't really thought of before, I select that my son isn't really growing normally, that he seems to have respiratory problems as well as big eyebrows and a swollen belly, in addition to a few other symptoms. Now that Symptom Matcher has narrowed the possible genetic conditions to a manageable number on the back end, it wants to learn more through a narrative. I'm presented with a series of patient stories, and will rate them from sounds not at all like my son to sounds a lot like my son. Based on the information I've entered so far, Symptom Matcher has put together a final review of what I've entered, in case I've missed something or want to change an answer. Now Symptom Matcher has refined the list of possible genetic conditions, and it will rank those conditions from most to least likely. Let's look at the results of my personal experience with Symptom Matcher. In this case, a possible explanation for my son's symptoms is NPS 1, which is at the top of the list, followed by NPS 2 at a close second. Now I have several actions that I can take. I can learn more about this condition by clicking on the NPS 1 link and going directly to Think Genetic. I can print the results for my son's doctor as a tear sheet to inform them on what the analysis has shown. I can save the report and come back later with my custom profile. There's also a section on tips for talking with the doctor that will be useful as I decide how to talk to the doctor about what I uncovered and discuss how to proceed. Finally, if I have other questions about Symptom Matcher's conclusions, I can ask a Think Genetic counselor and get answers within 48 hours. Think Genetic has outlined a realistic example of uncovering potential genetic possibilities using Symptom Matcher. We started with a generic search like so many do, and concluded with actionable steps for reducing the time to diagnosis, empowering me with relevant and personalized information. For more information on the Think Genetic Symptom Matcher, please visit thinkgenetic.com.
So there you have the story of what we've tried to build and are building. And again, we have the vision of having all 7,000 conditions covered and in Symptom Matcher. Well, I shouldn't say all in Symptom Matcher because we're not sure what it's going to look like when we get to about number 2,000. It gets a little sketchy. But to the extent we can, we will cover all the rare genetic diseases. That's my story. Thank you.
Thank you for 2 wonderful talks. We've got plenty of time for questions if anyone has a question.
Thank you. I have a question for each of you. For the first presenter, is that the most common variant of the mutation, or if there's 20 different variations of a genetic mutation, can you recognize all of them by the physical symptoms or just one of the variants?
So the answer is we don't know. And so what we do is we feed the machine, our system, with the information, and the machine spits out the results. That's the beauty of artificial intelligence. When we started this back in 2011, we had to really guide and teach the machine to think like a genetic, a clinician. But we evolved, and about 3 years ago, we've implemented a method called deep learning, whereby we actually feed a lot of data into the machine. The machine comes back and says, we've identified, or I've identified a pattern that is associated with either, a complete gene, a pathway, or a specific variant. And what we can do is continue to train the system until we find more and more samples and have more definitive results.
Okay, and another question is are you sticking to ones where the clinicians say there's definite physical characteristics? We have a disease that was just diagnosed, the gene was just found about 5 years ago. And it's not real obvious, but every time I look at a picture of them, there's something common about them, like their smile and their personality or something. Would it be able to find something like that when it's not the shape of the eyes or the chin or something?
We hear that story so often. It's just amazing. And the parents are really the drivers of that. The parents come to us and say, we have these meetings, and there's something common about all of our kiddos. And so the answer is we work with clinicians, but we found that it's very powerful to work with patient advocacy groups and parents specifically to learn from them, because you guys have the most experience. You are the real experts, even if you don't have a medical education. We have never said no to working with a group and trying to see if our technology can help.
Great, I'll be calling you. And for the other gentleman, do you think as more and more clinicians and institutions do whole exome and whole genome sequencing, that will make this needed because they'll get diagnosed, they'll find the variant right away?
Well, if they're screened early, but how do you get somebody to get screened? That's going to be the question. How do they know that they want to get the genome sequencing?
Well, I would say they should get to the point when anybody comes in with something that they're not sure of, it's cheaper to do whole exome these days than did an MRI. So why not do it right at the hospital?
Oh, I agree with that. But the key is they have to come. They have to come. They have to
have symptoms.
Yeah. Well, even if they have symptoms, they have to think that that's a solution.
Well, the clinicians are the ones that need to be educated. Instead of saying it could be this or could be that, this should be their first step, in my opinion.
If I may add to that, I think, whole exome sequencing is a great technology. And one of the problems with this technology is that it reveals almost too much information, right? So the phenotype, the clinical signs that we annotate, that we learn, are extremely important in trying to filter out the noise, so to speak, from this test and really hone in on the right variants. So I think phenotyping, whether it's textual or with technologies like computer vision, should be side by side with exome sequencing.
Yeah, I agree.
I was just going to comment that I think having Think Genetics is going to be even more important as people have exomes, because you come back and you get an answer and you say, what the heck is that? And you may get like one printout, or your genetic counselor may dig really deep and try to find something good for you. But with Think Genetic, we're trying to make it, I just got diagnosed, what does this mean? So hitting every question from, is my kid dying next year, to, how do I get their eyes to close if they don't close at night so we can prevent scarring? There's two parts to it. One is the people who don't have an answer, and the other one is, I've got an answer, now what do I do?
Great, thank you.
Great, how'd they do?
Hi, my name is Nardo Manlotto with Catalyze. In terms of looking into how you train your system, right? So you look into positive and negative. Is your goal to actually mimic the human knowledge, or is your goal to be better than human knowledge?
I guess the question is for me.
For both.
I want to share my perspective of artificial intelligence. I don't subscribe to the vision of the rise of the machine, and that the machine is going to become better than human beings in cognitive ability, in processing information, understanding it. What I do believe that artificial intelligence is doing right now, better than humans, is processing huge amounts of data. And so a physician is limited to their own life experience. What we do with thousands of physicians using our software is we crowdsource their knowledge. And to a certain extent, we bring in more data than they could ever do alone. But we still need the physician to understand what we're doing, to evaluate it, and see if it makes sense.
I would echo that. And I mentioned the example of Marfan and depressed chest. That sounded like a silly answer, but that's the kind of intuition you can get from, because it sees additional data that you may not have thought of. It doesn't make it up. It just sees something else that's an outlier and says, well, does this apply? So in this case, obviously it didn't. It wasn't about psychiatry, but it could. It could find something that you had never thought of that it has in its database, but it's not making it up.
So do you think at a certain point that after you've crowdsourced what human knowledge is, that the machine will have more data things that humans have never seen before, then eventually machines would be much smarter.
The majority of humans and the majority of clinicians would have never seen what we have. One of the favorite answers that I get from a clinician after interviewing them and how they use Face2Gene is not that Face2Gene has discovered something or that Face2Gene had diagnosed something. It is that Face2Gene helped me kind of help the juices flow in my mind. I'm reminded of things that I've maybe read sometime in a textbook, but now it seems reasonable.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing, that my disease, cutis laxa, there are about 200 of us in the world. I would suggest, maybe somebody here has seen it or knows of it, but probably nobody here does. But at the University of Pittsburgh, there are several people that absolutely know. If you ask them the question, they'll answer the question. So that knowledge is in the system. So we may not all know it, but collectively we do.
Colin Stewart from Bristol. Thank you for some two brilliant presentations. They were really exciting, I thought. Dekal, can I just ask you, does facial maturity cause much trouble for you? You showed a lot of photographs of children. Have you got lots of adults in your database? And do some syndromes particularly change from babies to adults as well?
So yes, we have a lot of adults in our system, but we're mainly focused on kiddos. And the reason is that the majority of patients with rare diseases are children. That's who comes through the offices, the clinics, and that's what we mostly see. And that's where we think that we can mostly be helpful. But what we've seen in many syndromes is that some of them share a phenotype throughout adulthood. Some of them change throughout the years. And so it's so important to capture that longitudinal information, to be able to stratify the database based on ethnicity, gender, age groups, to become more accurate for each age group, but also to see what is the natural history of this disease. How does it change over time? It's also helpful for efficacy studies. If we have a treatment, does it reduce or does it refine those very distinct facial features over time?
Thank you. And also, where some of us are diagnosing clusters of people with very newly diagnosed diseases, how do we work with you to actually get those into your database at speed?
First of all, we can work together on specific projects, but I think what you're describing here on clustering patients, that's where our technology is extremely powerful alongside exome sequencing or genome sequencing, because these two pieces of information, the phenotype and the genotype, go hand in hand. There is no diagnosis without one or the other, or in the future there will not be. And so we have to be able to cluster different groups and kind of, like in a Venn diagram, hone in on the people that share both the same variants and the same phenotype to really understand the disease. And we can talk after this presentation.
Just quickly, I wanted to point out that I'm a mother of a son with Fragile X syndrome, and within 3 to 5 seconds, I spotted the individual in your cluster of pictures with Fragile X accurately. So there's definitely something to be said for this, and I can also, when I'm out in society, I can see other people that I'm like, I bet that child has Fragile X. So thank you both for the technologies that you're working on and helping to shorten that diagnostic odyssey. I think it's amazing work, so thank you.
Thank you.
I would share one story that when I finally got diagnosed, Dawn said, well, that's obvious. Of course that's what it is. I see it. And, and she works with Fabry patients primarily, and if you put her in a room like this, she could go around and pick them out just immediately. You don't have to do any testing. She will know. Anyway.
Hey, thank you both. For Think Genetics, what is I apologize if I just missed it, but how do you add knowledge to that system? I looked at my daughter's gene, ADNP, and I saw that it wasn't on there, and I noticed that some of the sources are kind of Emory heavy, maybe. I was just wondering how knowledge is added to Think Genetics.
Right. Oh, look, she's jumping in.
The sources actually aren't Emory. If you click on that button, it'll show you what the real sources are. The reason it says Emory is because Emory wrote the answers. So we reference underneath it. So click that reference thing. We just need to make it clearer because under reference, you'll click it and that's when the real references are.
I see. What about knowledge creation?
Genetic counselors. If you show us that you care, we'll put you up higher in the numbers.
Okay. And that question was,
look,
what about
I just got a
malnutrition?
card right here. And so I'm like, okay, got to put these diseases in next. We had to prioritize some way. And then so we just tried to figure out,
of course.
People who get newborn screening are looking for answers. People who get carrier testing are looking for answers. People who, are looking for clinical trials. And then we went for what's real common. And then after that, now it's, show us that you really are interested and want to partner with us. And then we'll put in.
Here you go.
See?
Partnership complete. Cool, thank you.
Yeah, the business answer. So this week, while I've been in the booth, we've gotten signed up 30 additional advocacy partners. Of those 30, 25 were in our database. The other 5 will immediately go to the top of the list. We curate about 10 a month, and we find experts in the field, and then we do it. And it has come through a review process before we put it up. So it's not write some questions and answers and hand it in. We have a very complex system that we've refined over the last 3 years, that we know what data we want, and we want it referenced, and we won't accept it until we get it, and then we'll review it with our medical staff to make sure that it's accurate before we'll post it.
I know, I'm so bossy. Then we'll talk to our advocacy partners and we'll say, does this meet what you need? Because we want to make sure that we're doing it the way that you want to read about it and that you think patients who are new to it should hear about it. Just one quick example for Huntington's disease. We wrote this comprehensive thing. It was written by a true genetic counselor expert in Huntington's disease. And we talked to the HDSA, and they said, we love your material, but we want to focus on psychiatric early symptoms of Huntington's disease. We don't want to focus on being a movement disorder. So we said, okay, how about if we tweak this, we change this, we focus on this? And they're like, yep, that's it, go. So we're not asking our partners to write things. We just want you to spot check it and say, this is good, or, oh, I don't like this answer, or you really missed our really cool resource. We have this conference every year. Make sure you have people there. So we really do formally partner after we go through all this medical, editing checks. Gene Reviews is one of our biggest resources because that is such strong information. It's just that it's not written for patients. If we could ingest Gene Reviews and just throw it into Watson, that'd be so easy. We tried that. That didn't work.
She takes after her mother.
All right. Are there other questions?
Hi there, Chris Adams from Sidon. We haven't met, we only met by email, I think, and I wondered what your business model, though, is. Sorry to come to, because everything's free, so it can't all be free. So who's ultimately going to pay for this?
We decided very early on that we're not going to take money from patients or from providers. What we saw as an unmet need within the pharma world is that we can help. And you saw the illustration of that iceberg that Dave showed. There are so many patients out there that are not found. I think that's part of the reason that the prices of these therapies is so high. Now, if we can go into that process, find more patients, reduce the price overall in the macro economic setting, reduce the prices of pharmaceuticals, of therapeutics, that's where we can make a profit without hurting the patients. So it's a win-win situation. That's how we see that.
I would agree with that.